Yo, what's going on, everybody? Welcome to the Bloomburrow tips, tricks, and traps video to help get you ready for pre-release this time around. I have just come off of playing the Early Access Streamer event, so of course, want to share some thoughts about the cards I played with, some thoughts about the format in general, and just want to point you in the right direction for sealed deck building overall. So first things first, I think it's good just to lay out what I think your sealed deck is going to look like in this format, or what you should try to be building towards. And I think in this format, more than most others that we've seen recently, this is going to be a format where you want to try to build a two-color deck. This doesn't mean that you're not going to maybe splash for a good card, splash for a removal spell or two that your main colors don't offer you. But if you just look at the 10 two-color pairs that I have on screen right now, each of them being represented by an animal, so, blue-green frogs or black-green squirrels. In some formats, the two-color pairs and their archetypes are more suggestions. Maybe they're kind of loose two-color pairs where it's like, okay, like you could be doing this thing, but maybe you're doing something else. I think most pools in this format, the best deck in them is just going to be find the deck that has the strongest and most supported creature type archetype and lean into that. A lot of the really powerful cards and even some of the rares in this set get better the more streamlined your deck is. So the more you're doing the squirrels, graveyard, forage thing, or the more you are bouncing a bunch of your creatures with your frog deck, the better your cards get. This isn't the kind of format where I would really suggest, like, take all your good cards and try to play 4 or 5 colors, because most of the time when you're looking at your pool and saying, what are my strongest cards, they're not just generically awesome cards. They're usually going to be like great in one deck or another. So they're not going to be great splashes. Like, for example, if you have a black-red lizard deck, well, there's not going to be that many green cards that you would want to splash in the deck that make your black-red lizard deck better. The other thing, too, is that fixing in this set is pretty sparse. It's not devoid of fixing by any means. There's 2 lands at common, Uncharted Haven and Hidden Grotto. There's also a few artifacts to help you fix, like 3-Tree Mascot and Fountainport Bell. But there is less fixing in this set than I think in a lot of other draft sets recently. And I think that's pointing you towards the direction of, yeah, you should just try to play 2 colors and maybe splash something if you really feel like it's worth it. I do want to call out, when talking about fixing here, one card I was really impressed with today, Patchwork Banner. This is a 3-mana artifact that taps to add a mana of any color, but you also choose a creature type when it enters, and creatures of that chosen type get +1/+1. So pretty powerful effect, either if you are splashing or, in a 2-color deck, totally fine too. A little bit of ramp, boost your creatures. Really good in like a go-wide rabbit deck where you're pumping a lot of creatures. So keep your eye out for this one. I think most of your sealed decks are going to want to play this card. So I'm going to go through the archetypes and kind of talk through some thoughts on them, the ones that I have thoughts on anyways. But one thing I want to point out that makes sealed deck building a lot easier is they included quite a few cards to bridge the gap between multiple archetypes. So for example, we've got a couple changelings in the set. So we've got 3-Tree Mascots and another changeling at common, another artifact creature. So if you just need one more frog, one more mouse, one more lizard in your deck, these changelings get the job done. But there's also a cycle, 2 cycles actually, 10 cards at common, 1 for each color, of these duos, Tree Guard Duo and Life Creed Duo, and they are 2 creature types, 2 relevant creature types, Bat Bird or Frog Rabbit. So I would pull these aside. They're all pretty good. Maybe 1 or 2 are less good than the others, but most of the cards in this cycle are pretty good. I might put these aside when I'm deck building, just to be like, these are my free bingo space cards, where I'm like, I'm pretty happy to put these in any green deck. The Tree Guard Duo, for example, pretty decent in any green deck. Okay, so let's talk some of the archetypes now. And let's start with some good news. And the good news is that the weird deck of the format that they're trying, the new kind of oddball archetype frogs, blue-green frogs, where you're trying to bounce, pun intended, you're trying to bounce your things, blink your own things for enter the battlefield value. I actually think is a deck that plays pretty well. It's a very good long game grindy deck, so well suited for sealed as well. And 2 cards I really want to point out are Sunshower Druid and Pawn Prophet. I think these are 2 of the more important cards for this frog archetype, because when you're spending mana and cards maybe to bounce your creatures or pick your creatures up, put them in your hand, you start to lose a bit of tempo. You gain some value, but you lose some tempo. So I think it's really important to have some really cheap cards that are good to pick up, like the Pawn Prophet that can draw you a card, or Sunshower Druid. Really want to highlight this one because it's very easy to overlook this one, I think. Puts a counter on something, gains you a life. This is one of the better things, to just be able to go like, okay, I'm going to keep picking this up, keep gaining some life, keep growing my board. So definitely look out for these 2. But also, something that I found today while playing this deck, I did get to draft this deck, thankfully, it was pretty cool, is that this deck is one that I think you don't mind splashing in, because there are some really good enter the battlefield effects in other colors. So if you've got enough good things that can blink things, can bounce things, and you're like, yeah, you know, this single pipped card that's really good to blink, and I'm going to talk about one in a few minutes here, that might be worth it here if I have the fixing. So yeah, I was pretty impressed with the Frog deck, both from my side and from my opponent's side. Then I want to talk about Squirrels. Squirrels, I think, was just another deck that was pretty good. Just a good mid-range deck that cares about the graveyard, good at grinding once again, has good efficient cards. And the card that I want to call it here for this deck is Cash Grab. If you played Modern Horizons 3, you might know Malevolent Rumble, and that card was a sleeper card of that set. This card is not quite as good as Malevolent Rumble, but also quite a strong card. Mill 4 cards, fills up the grave for your foraging, which a lot of your squirrels do, gets you some card selection, gets you a food. Really a card that I'm happy to play multiple copies of. I had 3 copies of this in one of my decks earlier, and it was just fantastic. Helped me find my best cards, got my engines going, so don't overlook Cash Grab. Moving on to Blue-Black Threshold. This is not a super supported deck. I think it's one of the lesser supported decks. There's not a ton of self-mill in this set. There's a bit of Surveil. You know, maybe about 10 cards that surveil, but you're not always going to want to put the card you see from surveilling into your graveyard. So I found that getting to Threshold it's a task, and especially if you have foraging cards, it kind of fights with your blue-black Threshold card, so something you kind of have to worry about there. Definitely a fine deck. If you've got good blue and black cards, you can totally do it. And, you know, I could see some world where you're like a green-black deck with Cash Grab and splashing some of the blue Threshold cards, but not what I think you're going to get into unless you have just some really good rares. Then I think another one of the obviously good decks in this format is Red-White Valiant, which is sort of like heroic, but counts your abilities as well as spells, but only triggers once per turn. It's a pretty straightforward red-white aggro deck, but the thing I want to point out for Valiant is just remember that it does count abilities. I think it's easy to, you know, if you've only seen these cards a few times, either gloss over that word ability, or just even if you know that, forget what counts as an ability. So for example, equipping, that counts as Valiant. So if you've got something like Shortbow here with a 1 mana equip cost, and you've got 3 Valiant creatures, every single turn you just go 1 mana, trigger my Valiant, 1 mana, trigger my Valiant, 1 mana, trigger my Valiant. All 3 of your things can trigger for just a single mana, so that's pretty good. Obviously combat tricks, those play well too, but stuff like Bravekin Duo here, just ability on a creature, you can tap it to give something +1/+1, that'll trigger it too. So a little bit of tricksy stuff going on here. I think it's an aggro deck that has some interesting play patterns to it, so again, just wanted to keep your eye out for. It's one of the better decks. I was also pretty impressed with Red-Black Lizards. There's a lot of really good lizard cards in this set. I think, you know, this being a new creature type that they're supporting, there's not that much lizard support in all of, you know, Magic's 30 years. They really wanted to put some good lizard cards out there, so a lot of the lizard payoffs are pretty strong. Fireglass Mentor is a pretty good one here, just helps draw extra cards on your 2-drop. So you're going to be playing a lot of these like cheap little menace creatures to make sure you can damage your opponent each turn. A lot of the lizards naturally have menace, so it's pretty easy to actually be able to trigger all your things they care about when your opponents have lost life. And probably a good time to bring up a card that I said I was going to talk about a few minutes ago. Thought Stalker Warlock, card with a very good enter the battlefield effect that I did splash in my blue-green frog deck, but is definitely at home in the lizard deck. This card is phenomenal. It's a 3-mana 2/2 menace that if you've dealt your opponent damage, when this comes in, it just comes in and thought seizes them, almost like Grief, you know, modern playable card Grief. And if you didn't deal damage, well, they still discard a card. So extremely powerful. This is going to be one of the best cards in the set for limited and constructed, honestly. So keep an eye out for that one. Also, not just a lizard card you could play as in any black deck would be very good. Rabbits was another archetype that I was pretty impressed with. Nothing too complicated here, but I do want to call out the hybrid common card here. All the color pairs get a hybrid common card, but none of them are as good as Head of the Homestead. This is 5 mana for a 3/2 that makes 2 rabbit tokens, so just so much power and toughness across so many creatures. Really, really good if you're going wide, but even if you're not a go wide deck, 3 bodies for 1 card on a common, that's phenomenal. Then the last few decks to talk about here, we've got Black-White Bat Life Gain and Green-Red Raccoon Expending Mana. So expend is whenever you spend your 4th, usually it's 4th. There's also some bigger expend numbers, but usually when you spend your 4th mana on a spell, you get to trigger something. And both these decks are pretty, what you see is what you get. We've seen like a Black-White Life Gain deck here and there in Limited, and a Red-Green mid-range deck. They're pretty similar to what we normally see. I think 2 decks that are a little bit less good, a little bit less supported, their support cards are maybe a little bit weaker than some of the other archetypes, are the Blue-Red Spells deck and the blue-white flying bird deck. Not to say that you shouldn't lean this way if you think your pool has a good blue-red deck, but I just think it's going to come together a little bit less often than some of the other color pairs. I guess maybe if you're having the decision between like, oh, should I play this black-red deck or this blue-red deck I have? Of course, whatever's more fun, it's pre-release, of course, but if you have that competitive bent to you and you're like, which one's going to win more? I would probably lean away from blue-red if that's one of your options. So fine decks, I just don't think they're going to come together as often in your sealed pools. That's all. One slight word of caution is this uncommon cycle of lands that tap to add a colorless mana or tap to add a colored mana only for creature spells, then have an ability on top. I would generally play one of these in my deck, and then the second one I'm a little bit more gun-shy about, because only being able to cast your creatures, yes, you're going to be playing quite a few creatures in your deck, 14, 15, 16, but there's going to be quite a few times if you have multiple of these in play where you can't cast your removal spell, or you can't double spell the way you want. So they're good. They're going to be, I think, more good than bad for the first one. Not going to impact your mana base too much, but again, just a word of caution, I wouldn't play more than one. And I guess last thing to leave us on is, I think this set's a lot of fun. I had a lot of fun today playing, and I usually get fun playing in early access, but I thought the gameplay was really, really good. So look forward to good gameplay. There's a lot of good back and forth. Speed-wise, I don't think it's too fast. I think it's one of those sets where they really hit a good mix of late game decks have a chance, but also the early game decks don't just get brick walled. Definitely some good back and forth, and a lot of cards that stabilize you pretty well too if you do start off a little bit of a rocky start. So good luck this weekend. I have high hopes for this set. I hope you do well. If you're looking for more Bloomburrow content coming your way, be sure to stay subscribed. We're going to be posting a bunch, everything I know about the format coming up soon, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.